In the closing months of the Second World War, the island of Borneo emerged as one of the last contested territories in the Pacific theater. Among its vital points was Balikpapan, a coastal city on the island's eastern shore. It lay at the heart of the Netherlands East Indies oil production network, where refineries, storage tanks, and loading piers had long served the Japanese war economy. When Japan invaded the Dutch colonies in early 1942, Balikpapan's petroleum assets became a crucial logistical prize, providing high-grade aviation fuel and lubricants that sustained operations throughout Southeast Asia. By 1945, however, those same facilities had become symbols of depletion. Allied submarine campaigns and air raids had shattered Japan's shipping routes, while American and Australian planners viewed the remaining oil infrastructure as both a target and an opportunity. A site whose seizure could deny the enemy its last energy reserves and strengthen Allied control of post-war resource networks. Strategically, Balikpapan's position on Makassar Strait granted access to the deep water approaches between Borneo and Sulawesi, forming a potential maritime corridor linking the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. In Allied assessments of early 1945, this location carried dual value. It could secure sea lanes supporting future occupation and rehabilitation of the Netherlands East Indies, and it could provide a base for operations toward Java or the South China Sea. Yet, as the global war neared its end, questions surrounded the necessity of such a campaign. In Washington and London, some officials argued that Japan's defeat appeared imminent, with planned operations against the home islands already on the horizon. Others, particularly in Australia, viewed an offensive in Borneo as a means of fulfilling commitments to the Netherlands government in exile and ensuring that Australian forces played a decisive role in the Pacific's final stage. Australia's involvement in Borneo stemmed from a broader restructuring of Allied command under General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. Following the Philippine campaigns of 1944 to 45, MacArthur's headquarters designated the Australian Aegis Corps, under Lieutenant General Leslie Moore's head, to lead the Borneo operations. The overarching plan, codenamed Oboe, envisioned sequential landings at Tarakan, Brunei Bay, and finally Balikpapan. These were intended to eliminate remaining Japanese garrisons, secure oil installations, and establish bases for post-war administration. By mid-1945, two of these objectives had been achieved. Tarakan was captured in May and Brunei Bay in June. Balikpapan, scheduled as the final and most complex phase, Oboe Two, would require the largest amphibious operation ever mounted by Australian forces. For the Japanese, the defense of Balikpapan represented an attempt to preserve both prestige and access routes, rather than any realistic expectation of holding the ground indefinitely. The garrison, numbering approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men of the 71st Independent Mixed Brigade under Major General Kamada, faced isolation. Supply routes from Java and the Philippines had been cut, and the destruction of oil production facilities by repeated Allied bombing in 1944 had rendered the city's economic value largely obsolete. Nevertheless, local command structures sought to fortify coastal defenses and delay any landing through mines, artillery positions, and improvised bunkers. The terrain itself, narrow coastal plains bordered by ridges and dense vegetation, favored defensive tactics but offered limited depth for maneuver. Japanese strategy emphasized inflicting maximum casualties through resistance at prepared positions, rather than attempting counteroffensives. From the Allied side, the preparation for Balikpapan reflected the operational maturity of late-war amphibious warfare. The 7th Australian Division, comprising roughly 33,000 personnel, including the 18th, 21st, and 25th Brigades, was assigned the main assault. They were supported by a vast naval and air component under United States command, more than 250 ships, including cruisers, destroyers, and landing craft, and over 250 aircraft from the U.S. 13th Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force. Prior to the landing, months of aerial reconnaissance and bombardment had targeted Japanese fortifications, bridges, and oil tanks. Between January and June 1945, Allied aircraft dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on the Balikpapan area, while minesweepers cleared extensive defensive minefields that had rendered the approaches hazardous. The preparatory bombardment alone was among the heaviest of the entire Pacific campaign, relative to the scale of the target. Politically, the Balikpapan operation also illustrated diverging wartime priorities. For the Netherlands government in exile, the liberation of Borneo symbolized the reassertion of Dutch sovereignty over colonial possessions that had been occupied for more than 3 years. For Australia, participation in Oboe Two provided tangible proof of independent military capability within the Allied framework, countering perceptions that the nation's forces had played a secondary role after 1943. MacArthur, for his part, saw the offensive as a means of consolidating control over territories within his operational zone before the anticipated transition to post-war occupation. Within Japanese circles, conversely, the defense of Balikpapan was framed less as an expectation of victory than as a moral obligation to fight to the end in defense of imperial territory, despite the shrinking logistical base and the hopelessness of reinforcement. By June 1945, the preconditions for the coming battle were fully in place. The Allied invasion fleet assembled at Morotai, carrying more than 180 landing craft, 13,000 vehicles, and 33,000 tons of supplies. Naval bombardments had already reduced much of the city's visible infrastructure to ruins. Japanese engineers completed last-minute demolitions of remaining oil installations to prevent capture intact. Local civilians, including Indonesians and Chinese laborers who had endured forced labor under occupation, faced renewed dislocation as both sides prepared for combat. In this setting, the final amphibious operation of the Pacific War was about to begin, not as a struggle over resources that no longer flowed, but as a demonstration of control, logistics, and persistence in the war's closing weeks. Dawn on July 1st, 1945 found the invasion convoy already in position southeast of Clandestine. In the preceding fortnight, minesweepers had forced lanes through defensive belts laid along the approaches, working within range of coastal guns that covered the bay and the headlands. The clearance effort cost multiple craft and crews and did not remove every obstacle. Underwater stakes and wire entanglements still barred portions of the surf line. Naval and air forces attempted to compensate. Cruisers and destroyers had shelled identified batteries and trenches for days, while heavy bombers and fighter bombers struck road junctions, revetments, and suspected command posts. On the final morning, additional bombardment missions fell across the clandestine ridges and the beach strip before the landing waves formed. The fire plan emphasized suppression rather than annihilation, allowing adjustment when defenders revealed secondary positions. The assault echelons of the 7th Australian Division moved from transports to tracked landing vehicles and boats in the early hours. Alligator LVTS, DUKWS, and LCVPS, crewed largely by United States amphibious tractor and engineer boat units, took on the 1st Infantry Companies and guides. Beach designations followed a 3-sector scheme, red and yellow to the west, green to the east, each tied to prominent shoreline features and pre-plotted artillery data. Brigadier Frederick Chilton's 18th Brigade was allocated the left, landing 2 battalions abreast. Elements of Brigadier Ivan Dougherty's 21st Brigade took green on the right. The 25th Brigade remained embarked as a floating reserve to expand or redirect the front after the initial lodgment. The timing window placed the first ramps dropping shortly before 9 a.m. The naval fire lifted at approximately 1,300 yards, transferring to inland targets as the landing craft crossed the final stretch. Smoke, dust, and craters from previous bombardments altered the skyline enough that 2 assault battalions touched down farther left than planned mixing units on red and yellow. Despite the misalignment and the presence of uncleared obstacles at the central sector, the first waves encountered only intermittent small arms and mortar fire. Within 15 to 20 minutes, platoons on all 3 beaches had pushed off the sand and onto the first inland tracks, establishing a contiguous beachhead. Early engineer teams began cutting paths through beach obstacles, while naval beach parties marked channels for subsequent waves. The Japanese garrison had constructed a layered defense close to the shoreline, Dutch-era concrete positions had been integrated into a trench and tunnel network along the clandestine spurs, supported by anti-tank ditches and interlocking machine gun fields of fire. Coastal guns and dual-purpose pieces sited on the heights were intended to fire on ships, beaches, and assembly areas. Yet the combination of prior bombardment, the destruction of telephone lines, and the loss of many forward observers limited coordinated responses in the opening hours. Local platoon and company-level actions were still possible, especially where bunkers retained overhead protection and covered approaches to key knobs and ridges. Australian planners divided opening assignments between clearing dominant heights and securing routes toward the town and the airfields. On the left, companies were ordered to seize the ridgelines north of Clandestine that controlled movement toward Balikpapan proper. On the right, units advancing on green aimed for the road to Sepinggang and Manggar airfields. The ground lent weight to both tasks. Short, steep slopes, limited armored maneuver, and channeled infantry onto spurs narrow enough to be blocked by a single well-placed bunker. Engineers used Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges to breach wire and embrasures. Artillery forward observers landed with the first waves, shifted concentrations onto reverse-slope trenches as they were identified. By midday, localities on several controlling heights had been taken after close-range fighting, supported by self-propelled guns and tanks ferried in on later waves. Coordination problems typical of amphibious operations remained. The mislanding on the left delayed the arrival of some support weapons at assigned sectors. A number of tanks broke down on soft ground at the foot of the spurs, reducing immediate firepower where infantry had counted on direct fire against concrete positions. The infantry compensated through limited objective attacks and by returning to original boundaries as guides re-established control along prearranged axis markers. Naval gunfire liaison officers called in short missions onto bunker clusters beyond the reach of initial company mortars. As the beachhead expanded, the first comparative picture of opposing forces in the sector emerged. Australian combat strength ashore grew by successive waves to brigade scale with attached engineers, artillery parties, and armored troops. Japanese positions appeared in company and battalion groupings, typically 20 to 60 men per locality with mortars, machine guns, and occasional field pieces, and reinforced by armed labor units in trench work and carrying tasks. The immediate objective balance reflected these numbers. The Australians aimed to link red, yellow, and green into an arc that would both shield the beach maintenance area and open routes inland. The Japanese aimed to channel the advance into kill zones along the ridge noses, then counterattack at night to retake specific knolls or to disrupt supply dumps on the foreshore. Air operations in the opening phase were shaped by basing constraints. With Tarakan's airfield not yet fully serviceable for fighter operations, most sorties originated from the southern Philippines, imposing a longer cycle between requests and on-station presence. This required deliberate scheduling, pre-planned time-on-target strikes during the approach and the first hours ashore, then on-call missions under tighter control once forward air controllers established signals and panel codes near the leading companies. Naval aviation and carrier-capable aircraft supplemented as weather allowed, providing additional reconnaissance of trails beyond the clandestine heights and along the coastal road. Civilian presence in the immediate landing zones had thinned during the preliminary bombardment and demolitions, but the opening phase still intersected with non-combatant movement. Indonesian and Chinese residents displaced by earlier forced labor schemes, or by defensive work sought shelter inland or near villages outside the bombardment footprint. Military police and liaison detachments marked assembly points to separate civilians from supply routes and to reduce the risk of confusion in areas where both combat and engineering tasks converged on the same roads. Captured documents and local accounts provided initial orientation on storehouses, fuel depots, and demolitions previously executed to deny use of industrial sites. By late afternoon on July 1st, the lodgment measured several kilometers in depth at its greatest point. The 25th Brigade began to debark to assume roles in the center and to relieve assault battalions for continued movement. Field artillery batteries were coming ashore to replace naval gunfire for targets beyond the first ridges. On the right, Patrols probed east along the coastal road towards Sepinggang, reporting enemy artillery beyond the airfield precinct. On the left, company commanders reported newly discovered trenches and caves requiring methodical clearance, slowing the pace compared to the rapid morning advance. The opening phase closed with defined lines, established supply points, and a clearer map of the system of ridges that would govern the next week's operations. Strategic intentions for the Balikpapan operation took shape along parallel but not symmetrical lines. For the Allied command in the Southwest Pacific, the objective was to secure a lodgment that would control the port, the coastal road network, and the two airfields at Sepinggang and Mangar, thereby creating a base for post-war administration and maritime security in the Makassar Strait. Within that frame, Australian Bi Corps assigned the 7th Australian Division to seize and hold the Clandestine Ridge system, expand eastward to the airfields, and push north into the urban and refinery districts only after the beach maintenance area was protected. The operational method emphasized combined arms at short range, infantry advancing by spur and saddle, tanks and self-propelled guns to neutralize hardened points, and engineers to breach obstacles and restore mobility. Naval gunfire would precede each bound and then shift to counter-battery and interdiction once field artillery came ashore to assume the main fire support load. Japanese planning began with the premise that reinforcement was unlikely. The garrison, organized around independent mixed brigade elements with attached naval troops and labor units, distributed its defense in belts. Coastal guns and dual-purpose weapons covered the beaches and anchorages. Machine gun bunkers and caves on the clandestine spurs were linked by trenches that allowed movement under cover. Anti-tank ditches and timber obstacles closed likely approaches. The brigade's mission was to delay and attrit rather than maneuver, fix the attacker on the ridge noses, counter-attack at night in company strength against recently seized knobs, and conserve ammunition for positions that commanded roads and defiles. Demolitions on bridges, culverts, and oil installations were prioritized to deny the use of infrastructure. The command accepted the loss of outlying posts to maintain coherence on ground that offered interlocking fire. Logistics shaped both designs. Allied supply had to cross a multi-day convoy route from Morotai, then transition across beaches with limited exit points. The maintenance plan projected a daily flow of ammunition, fuel, water, and rations measured in thousands of tons after D-Day, scaled by the number of landing ships and craft, and by the rate at which engineers could clear exits. To reduce congestion, loads were pre-sorted by brigade and serial, with separate dumps for engineer explosives, medical stores, and tank ammunition. Naval beach parties established traffic circuits and signal stations to manage the sequence of waves. The limitation was time on station for air support. With fighter cover largely based at distance until nearer fields could be opened, the concept of fires relied on prolonged naval bombardment, early landing of artillery observers, and pre-planned target packages to compensate for slower air cycles. On the Japanese side, supply was measured in what had been stockpiled before isolation set in. Artillery ammunition was limited. Most mortars were supported by hand-carried bombs, replenished from depots and caves. The defensive minefields at sea represented the one investment that could impose costs before ground combat began. In parallel, fieldworks drew on forced labor and requisitioned materials. Timber and earth revetments reinforced old concrete, while tunnels and crawlways allowed small groups to reappear after bombardment. The deficit lay in communications. Wire nets were vulnerable to shelling, and radio sets were few, pushing control downward and encouraging a tactic of local independence within a general instruction to resist and counterattack by night. Doctrine translated these constraints into specific preparations. Australian battalions trained on Morotai for ridge fighting with rehearsed drills for bunker reduction, reconnaissance to identify flanking approaches, smoke to screen, direct fire, HE from tanks or assault guns to crack embrasures, then engineer teams with Bangalore torpedoes, satchel charges, and flame to finish. Matilda tanks, including close support variants and flamethrower conversions, were earmarked for tasks against covered positions, with infantry marking lanes through wire and pitfalls using tape and pickets. Communication between echelons drew on line laying forward from the beach, and on portable radios at company and platoon level, with artillery request formats standardized to reduce delay. A medical evacuation chain from regimental aid posts to beach-clearing stations was matched to the expected pattern of wounds from mines, small arms, and fragments in defile fighting. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized camouflage, deception, and depth scaled to the topography. Firing ports were masked until infantry approached within 50 to 100 meters. Alternate positions were sighted to enfilade expected assault lanes. Dummy trenches and abandoned weapons were left to draw fire. Where terrain permitted, concealed approaches were prepared for infiltration toward the beaches after dark, with routes marked in the defender's code and closed by day. The counterattack plan accepted attrition. Company groups were to probe for gaps rather than attempt to retake entire ridgelines, aiming to break newly established ties between neighboring companies and disrupt the buildup of artillery and supplies. Intelligence estimates informed both plans but introduced miscalculations. Allied photo reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations produced maps of strong points on the Clandestine Heights and along the coastal road, yet many tunnels remained undetected or were misplotted, leading to optimistic expectations about the permanent neutralization of certain bunkers after bombardment. Conversely, the assessment that oil installations would be largely unusable was accurate. Demolitions and previous air raids had destroyed much of the refinery value, reducing the campaign's economic return even if the area were captured quickly. On the Japanese side, estimates underestimated the scale of the amphibious lift and the capacity of the attackers to sustain artillery fire ashore within 24 hours, encouraging an assumption that prolonged naval gunfire would pause before field guns arrived. That gap did not materialize. Allied artillery observers landed early, and batteries began to fire while naval guns continued counter-battery work. Propaganda and information control also formed part of planning. Australian public statements framed the operation as a step toward restoring civil administration in the Netherlands East Indies and securing maritime routes. Internal guidance to troops stressed adherence to rules for civilian interaction and the importance of documenting damage to industrial facilities for later handover. Japanese notices to the garrison and local administrators emphasized the duty to protect imperial territory and warned civilians against collaboration, while also directing the evacuation of certain areas within the defensive belt. Both sides attempted to regulate rumors about casualties and progress, recognizing the effect of morale on units that would operate at close quarters for days. In the days before the landing, these designs translated into concrete staging measures: assault brigades loaded with a priority on engineer stores, signals detachments, and forward observer parties in early serials. Vehicle waterproofing and tank weighting kits were checked, and dozers were allocated to each beach to push exits through the berm. Naval bombardment plans assigned counter-battery targets to cruisers and destroyers and marked switch times to inland concentrations. Minesweeping groups rehearsed night approaches and plotted danger bearings to headlands. On the defending side, last-minute demolitions closed secondary roads, and caches of mortar bombs and food were shifted into deeper recesses. Listening posts near the surfline were instructed to hold fire until waves closed within small arms range, but gunners on the heights were authorized to engage minesweepers and control craft as soon as bearings were firm. By the morning of July 1st, the results of this planning were visible in the sequence of events already unfolding. The attackers' weight lay in a timed choreography: sweeps, bombardment, landings, clearance, and expansion, designed to maintain pressure without interruption. The defenders' weight lay in positions that could survive that choreography long enough to impose friction at each bound. The interval between those two logics, between the tempo of an amphibious machine and the endurance of a fortified ridge, defined the next phase of the campaign. The first day ashore set the frame, but the initial clashes that followed determined whether the landing would translate into freedom of movement. In the afternoon of July 1st, companies on the left worked methodically along the clandestine spurs. Each ridge nose had at least one concrete or timbered bunker oriented to enfilade the beach tracks, with auxiliary foxholes and grenade pits connected by shallow crawlways. Assaults formed around three elements: a base of fire from platoon automatics and 2-inch mortars, a direct fire component from tanks or self-propelled guns engaging embrasures at 50 to 150 meters, and an engineer team carrying Bangalore torpedoes, satchel charges, and flamethrowers. Progress was measured in tens of meters. Where a bunker survived initial hits, tanks traversed to find a better angle while infantry closed under smoke. Once a firing slit was cracked or sealed, engineers cleared the interior and the trench behind it, then marked the position to avoid duplication by later companies. On the right, forward patrols pushed toward Sepingang along the coastal road under intermittent artillery and mortar fire from positions east of the airfield. Japanese observers used short-lived glimpses through bombardment haze to correct onto road bends and culverts, forcing halts while dozers and pioneers filled craters and cut bypasses through the verge. The pattern repeated: short, deliberate movements, then a pause to realign boundaries and confirm that neighboring companies had kept pace on parallel spurs. Where the ground pinched into a saddle, a single undetected cave could block an entire advance. In several cases on the 1st and 2nd of July, company commanders shifted the axis to climb a flank spur first, using height to bring small arms fire onto apertures that frontal fire had not silenced. This tactic traded speed for lower casualties and gradually yielded the crest lines that overlooked Balikpapan town. Urban approach fighting began at the interface between the ridges and the refinery districts. Storage tanks that had escaped earlier demolition were already holed from air attack. Many others lay collapsed. The Japanese had mined service roads and left booby traps in pump houses and valve chambers. Australian patrols entered the outer streets after dark on July 1st, only to withdraw to the ridgeline, rather than risk fighting inside demolitions that could be triggered at close range. By morning, engineers and infantry re-entered with a clearer map of hazards. A local civil police presence, limited by occupation-era disruptions, provided fragments of information on which buildings had been used as billets or strongpoints. Military police established control points to separate returning civilians from supply convoys, and interpreter teams recorded locations of forced labor camps, whose occupants had been moved inland in previous months. The weight of the first Japanese countermeasures fell during July 1st to July 2nd in two forms: persistent mortar and artillery harassment of the beach maintenance area, and company-strength night probes against newly seized knobs. Harassment fire forced the spacing of dumps and the use of shell scrapes for drivers and pioneers. Night probes imposed alert states and flares along likely approaches. Where infiltration reached the rear of a newly taken ridge, defenders attempted to cut telephone lines and pull guide markers used to orient supporting weapons. In response, battalions placed small standing patrols forward of the line and allocated reserve platoons to immediate counterthrusts, no farther than 1 or 2 trench bays beyond the crest. These exchanges yielded minor territorial changes, but had cumulative effects on ammunition expenditure and fatigue. Naval gunfire and the early arrival of field artillery shifted the balance for engagements beyond the first crest lines. By the evening of July 1st, several batteries were in action, firing observed concentrations onto reverse slopes and suspected assembly gutters. Fire control parties established standard fire plans for dawn and dusk, when movement across cover was most likely. On July 2nd, counter-battery missions targeted guns east of Sepingang, whose fire had damaged road clearance efforts. Reports indicated that several pieces had been displaced to secondary pits, and follow-on missions adjusted accordingly. The gradual assumption of the primary fire support role by artillery ashore also released cruisers and destroyers to interdict movement along the coast road and to shell Manger approaches at longer range. Armor employment in the first engagements was constrained by ground and obstacles. Matilda tanks supported ridge assaults where approach lanes allowed. Close support variants engaged casemates with high explosive. Flamethrower conversions were committed against caves and heavily revetted positions. Mechanical failures on soft ground reduced available numbers at points in the line, and several vehicles bogged at the base of slopes where craters had filled with water. Recovery crews worked under covering fire to pull them back after dark. Coordination continued to improve as company radios and artillery nets stabilized, allowing planned sequences where tanks suppressed apertures, infantry closed with grenades and charges, and engineers completed the clearance. Once a spur was taken, dozers cut traverse tracks along the military crest to facilitate lateral movement without dropping to the road net under observation. Civilian impact in the opening clashes remained localized but visible. The bombardment phase had displaced many residents. Those who returned under white cloths or improvised flags were directed to assembly points for screening and assistance. Medical detachments treated both military and civilian wounded when fighting passed near inhabited clusters, and liaison teams documented damaged wells and food stores to allocate water and rations where possible without disrupting military priority. The presence of forced laborers and tunnel works complicated clearance. On several occasions, small groups emerged during or after engagements, requiring immediate separation from captured soldiers and rapid evacuation to the rear. By the end of July 2nd, the tactical picture exhibited distinct tendencies. On the left, the capture of additional spurs produced observation over the town and wharf area, enabling more precise fires on remaining strongpoints. In the center, the lodgement's depth increased as the 25th Brigade took over sectors and prepared to push through toward key road junctions. On the right, pressure mounted along the Sepinggang axis, but artillery east of the airfield and mine obstacles on the verge limited tempo. Night exchanges remained frequent, with defenders seeking to reoccupy small bays or to disrupt consolidation works on newly taken crests. Casualty returns reflected the character of the fighting. Attacker losses clustered around bunker reduction and mine incidents. Defender losses rose in positions that had been isolated from adjacent trenches and then subjected to combined arms at very short range. Unexpected results emerged alongside the anticipated patterns. Several bunkers that aerial photography and pre-invasion fires had marked as destroyed reappeared as functioning positions, their overhead cover having deflected or absorbed earlier hits. Conversely, some caves collapsed after initial probing, suggesting structural weakness from bombardment that assault teams exploited by firing into cracks and seams rather than attempting frontal entry. Minesweeping inshore continued to find hazards that affected the timing of landing craft and the delivery of heavy engineer plant, prompting adjustments in unloading schedules. These variables did not change the overall direction of advance, but shaped the method. Fewer broad rushes onto full ridge lines, more localized fights to secure each bay and traverse. The first engagements, therefore, delivered bounded gains with limited breakthroughs. The beach maintenance area functioned, artillery ashore grew in weight, and the clandestine system began to yield bay by bay. The Japanese garrison retained cohesion on selected heights and maintained intermittent control of fire lanes onto roads and saddles. Both sides adjusted, attackers refining bunker drills and lateral communications on crests, defenders shifting small groups to reconstitute localities and concentrating artillery on choke points. With positions on the edge of the town, now in Allied observation, and the route towards Sepinggang still contested, the campaign was set to expand in scope and intensity over the next several days. Escalation followed as soon as the beachhead stabilized. Between 3 and 6 July, the tempo rose across all axes, ridge fighting westward toward the refinery belt, methodical pressure along the Sepinggang Road, and artillery duels with batteries believed to be sighted around Mangar. The logistical machine ashore expanded to match. Beach parties opened additional exits, and amphibious trucks ran continuous circuits from LSTs to forward dumps. Daily tonnage increased with the landing of more field artillery, anti-aircraft detachments, and engineer plant. With each gain, the line extended, increasing the burden on signals and medical evacuation. Heat and humidity added strain. Water consumption targets rose, and casualty evacuation for heat illness climbed alongside wounds from mines and fragments. Ammunition expenditure matched the terrain. High demand for high-explosive-to-crack revetments, smoke to screen bounded advances, and demolition charges to finish casemates. On July 3rd, the 7th Australian Division enlarged its central sector to relieve assault battalions and to prepare a coordinated push toward road junctions, controlling access to Balikpapan town. Company objectives were defined by spurs and bays rather than by grid squares, creating a mosaic of local fights that demanded flexible boundaries. Progress on one spur could not outpace a neighboring spur without exposing flanks to cave fire. Battalion headquarters moved forward by bounds to maintain line of sight to company positions, while artillery observers climbed newly taken knobs to adjust concentrations onto reverse slopes. Misfires in communication still occurred. Shelling cut telephone lines, portable radios suffered from dead ground, and clearance of duplicated targets required repeated checks through liaison officers to conserve ammunition. Japanese resistance hardened as the garrison shifted reserves into the most promising localities. Night infiltration intensified. Small groups guided by pre-marked tracks used knolls between spurs to approach newly seized crests in darkness, seeking to cut guide tapes, lift panel markers, and throw grenades into weapon pits before slipping away. Mortars probed for dumps and road bends by sound and occasional flares. In the rear, harassing fire reached the beach maintenance area, often enough to force dispersal of vehicles and to interrupt unloading schedules. The pattern obeyed the defending concept. Conserve artillery ammunition for selected windows, rely on mortars and machine guns to hold by day, then counterattack by night in company strength where terrain promised enfilade fire if a knob could be retaken. Crisis points developed where terrain, weather, and coordination intersected. On July 4th, a sector on the left reported simultaneous pressure on two adjacent spurs when a cave complex that had been sealed earlier reopened through a secondary exit. Infantry on the crest faced fire from below and from a traverse route that allowed defenders to reoccupy a bay behind the forward platoon. The response relied on combined drills already rehearsed. Tanks moved to a lower shelf to deliver direct HE. Engineers brought up satchel charges under smoke, and artillery shifted a box around the traverse route to isolate the position. Clearance required hours and exhausted stocks of demolition charges, drawing on brigade reserves. The incident illustrated a recurring feature. Tunnels all but invisible from the air, or the first approach, could regenerate a locality unless the interior was fully collapsed. The central sector faced a different form of crisis when a soft patch under a causeway collapsed after heavy traffic, halting the flow of ammunition for several hours. Dozers and pioneer platoons built a bypass under intermittent shelling, and traffic control switched to one-way circuits to keep vehicles moving. A temporary shortfall in mortar bombs and smoke shells resulted, slowing planned assaults on two casemates. Battalion commanders delayed attacks rather than risk frontal movement without screens, and agreed to step the plan back to pre-planned artillery programs at dawn. The episode revealed the dependence of the tactical plan on a thin road net prone to interruption by a single crater or fire mission, and it prompted the sighting of emergency caches closer to forward companies. Air support continued, but basing distances limited responsiveness. Sorties from the southern Philippines maintained scheduled missions, while on-call strikes operated within a narrower window. Forward air controllers positioned on crests marked targets for fighter bombers, typically caves or gun pits that could not be engaged effectively by tanks. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was sporadic, but present near Mongar and along the coastal road. Weather fronts on July 5th briefly reduced visibility, complicating both air-ground coordination and naval spotting. In compensation, artillery ashore expanded to additional batteries, allowing a tighter cycle between request and fire. Counter-battery missions, targeted flashes reported east of Sapingang, some positions displaced after initial engagements, suggesting a pattern of shoot and move that reduced the effectiveness of plotted concentrations, but also reduced sustained pressure on the coastal road. Civil administration questions entered the operational picture, as more of the urban and industrial area came under observation. Liaison officers coordinated with Dutch civil affairs teams to plan re-entry into districts cleared of mines and booby traps, while interpreter teams compiled lists of buildings requisitioned during occupation and of sites used for forced labor. Requests for the return of specific properties could not be met amid ongoing combat, generating tension that remained procedural rather than violent. Australian orders emphasized separation of combat and civil tasks, and prioritized the security of supply routes, medical facilities, and water points. Comparative losses reflected the character of escalation. Australian casualty returns rose during bunker reduction and mine incidents, with killed and wounded clustered around assault teams, engineers, and tank crews operating in very short-range engagements. Japanese losses accumulated in localities isolated by combined fire and captured after depletion of mortar ammunition. But the garrison preserved a cadre for night counterattacks by disengaging when approaches became untenable. Numbers varied by day and sector, but the exchange favored the side with sustained munitions delivery and mechanical assets, provided terrain did not create a choke point. Ammunition conservation became an explicit theme for defenders. Some counterattacks on July 5th to 6th went forward with grenades and small arms only, testing newly established perimeters without the artillery preparation that had accompanied earlier attempts. Command challenges appeared on both sides. Australian brigade staffs coordinated 3 axes, where speed differed sharply, risking gaps if a rapid success on one spur outstripped neighbors. Reliefs within the line had to occur under cover, and by platoon, to prevent loss of orientation in the trench mazes. Japanese commanders faced the inverse, maintaining coherence among company groups that could no longer rely on wired communications, and that moved by tunnels and gullies rather than by open tracks. Dispatch riders and runners carried orders that might no longer match the situation when they arrived. The risk was that a night counterattack would collide with friendly infiltration from another locality. To mitigate, local signals employed prearranged calls and small lamps masked from above, increasing discipline demands during fatigue. By July 6th, Escalation had produced a map of persistent friction points. The left held the heights overlooking the wharf district, but still contained uncollapsed pockets requiring engineer attention. The center deepened enough to stage the next bound toward the town's road grid. The right reported cumulative progress towards Sapingang, with the Mangar zone still projecting artillery influence. The crisis was not a single breakthrough or collapse, but the daily possibility that a mine incident, a collapsed causeway, or an undetected traverse could halt momentum and increase exposure to night action. The operational answer remained constant: tighten the logistics rhythm, spread artillery observers along the crests, rotate assault teams to manage fatigue, and continue to reduce the ridge system. Bay by bay, until the town, the wharves, and the airfields were open to systematic clearance. The campaign reached its height between July 7th and July 10th, when the assault brigades attempted to break the remaining belts on the clandestine system, enter Balikpapan's industrial quarter in force, and extend control along the coastal road towards Sapingang and Mangar. The operational picture by July 7th showed approximately 2 brigades forward, with the 3rd rotating companies through assault and reserve roles. Australian strength committed ashore, infantry with attached engineers, artillery observers, anti-aircraft detachments, and the tank squadron, now operated on a frontage of several kilometers that hinged on a chain of spurs. Opposing them, company groups from the Japanese 71st Independent Mixed Brigade held a series of mutually supporting localities, 20 to 60 men, each tied to tunnels and caves with mortar teams and defilade. The numerical balance favored the attackers at the point of contact, but the ground kept engagement small and violent at short range. The peak opened with a coordinated push to clear the last knobs covering the town approaches. On July 7th, the left sector advanced by 2 bounded objectives to take saddle lines that controlled direct observation of the wharf area. Company plans paired tanks and infantry on parallel axes, one element suppressing apertures, while the other moved laterally along the military crest to cut communication trenches behind the objective. Engineers followed to collapse galleries with satchel charges and to fire flame into chambers whose overhead cover had resisted high explosive. The method repeated across adjacent spurs, but each success demanded time to consolidate. Guide tapes were extended, range cards redrawn, and alternate fire tasks issued to machine guns in case a counterattack broke through a nearby bay during the night. Urban entry coincided with ridge clearance rather than following it. Patrols moved into the refinery belt on July 7th to 8th, along streets broken by demolition pits, collapsed tanks, and felled poles. Many buildings were mined, others contained trip devices on stairwells and doors. In response, battalions created assault groups for block-by-block work, a street fire base with section automatics and a 2-inch mortar, a clearing team with demolition and wire cutters, and a flank team crossing yards and service alleys to reach back entrances. Civilians reappeared in small numbers, carrying lists of relatives missing after impressment into labor on the tunnels. Military police established lanes to keep non-combatants clear of routes used by tanks and dozers. Where industrial valves and pumps were intact, engineers tagged them for later inspection. Where demolition had already rendered a site unusable, the area was fenced with wire to prevent wreck-collapse accidents. On the right, the contest for the airfield approaches compressed into repeated encounters at road cuttings and culverts. Seppingang's vicinity saw craters that forced vehicles into narrow deviations, where a single machine gun could pin a platoon until tanks arrived. The Japanese habit of reoccupying galleries after bombardment forced a shift in technique. Rather than pass through after a single demolition, assault teams waited for engineers to blow secondary chambers and to block crawlways with rockfill. This slowed the rate of advance but reduced the number of night probes able to reappear in the rear of newly taken positions. By 8th July, Australian patrols were using the airfield's margins as reference points for artillery concentrations, and by 9th July, the runway area was under direct control, allowing survey parties to begin marking obstacles for later clearance. Mangar lay farther along the coast and remained a persistent source of harassing fire through this period. Counter-battery missions increased on August 9th, as flashes were plotted in cookhouse arcs and vegetation belts east of the airfield. The shift of the main fire support load from ships to guns ashore continued, but naval pieces still executed night tasks against suspected assembly gullies and the coastal track. The volume of fire was scaled to ammunition. Stocks landed through the beaches, which rose as additional LSTs unloaded. This permitted dawn programs that blanketed likely counterattack routes, and dusk programs that isolated objectives seized during the day. Japanese artillery activity diminished when pits were neutralized or displaced, but mortars remained active and accurate at the distances involved. Night fighting during the peak intensified. The garrison attempted company-strength counterattacks against specific knobs on July 7th to 9th, preceded by limited mortar concentrations and followed by infiltration through knolls between spurs. The aim was to detach a crest from its neighbors and to force a withdrawal to the next bay. In several instances, defenders reached tape lines at the edge of newly dug positions and had to be pushed out by local counterthrusts using reserve platoons. Tracer and flares revealed the proximity of forces. Telephone lines were cut repeatedly, and runners bridged the gaps with prearranged password systems to reduce accidental fire. Casualties on both sides increased during these hours. Attackers from grenade and small arms exchanges in trench mouths, defenders from pre-planned box barrages and machine guns sighted to sweep likely gullies. Armor played its maximum role of the campaign in these days. Matildas with close support, howitzers, gun tanks with armor-piercing for embrasures, and flamethrower conversions rotated through sectors to prevent mechanical exhaustion. The tank's tasks included direct fire on bunker faces, blasting traverse walls to expose rear chambers, and screening infantry movement across short open patches. Mechanical attrition remained a constraint. Bogging and track damage on rubble and crater lips took vehicles out of action for hours while recovery crews worked under small arms fire. Nevertheless, where tanks arrived in pairs with engineer escort, bunker reduction times shortened markedly, and trench systems collapsed more completely than earlier in the week. The supply rhythm necessary to sustain the peak imposed its own risks. With daily demand for demolition charges, tank ammunition, and water at its highest, the single-lane exits from the beach maintenance area approached saturation. A single hit on a turning circle or a breakdown at a narrow bend could halt deliveries to the forward dumps. Traffic control switched to timed convoys by axis, and amphibious trucks were assigned sectors to prevent duplication. Medical evacuation also peaked as the heat casualties climbed alongside wounds. Beach clearing stations expanded, and water points were guarded to maintain priority for forward units. Despite interruptions from sporadic shelling, the overall tonnage landed each 24 hours remained sufficient to support the artillery programs and the tank taskings designated in brigade orders. Intelligence during the peak became more granular and more local. Prisoners taken in the refinery belt provided sketches of tunnel layouts and ammunition caches, captured documents, recorded ration states, and mortar bomb stocks for several company groups. These pointed to a pattern of thinning reserves. Japanese counterattacks after July 9th showed fewer supporting mortar rounds and relied more on grenades and small arms bursts at very close range. The defenders compensated by choosing routes that avoided pre-plotted artillery boxes and by reusing crawlways that had been overlooked in earlier clearances. Allied patrols, in turn, began to mark cave mouths with paint and stakes for follow-on engineer teams to ensure no gallery remained uncleared when companies handed over to neighbors. By 10th July, the principal tactical aims of the peak phase had been met. On the left, crest lines overlooking the wharf and town were in Allied hands. In the center, the road grid within Balikpapan was penetrated enough to allow lateral moves beneath observation. On the right, Sepinggang was secured, and forward elements were established on the approaches toward Mangar. Comparative effects were visible. Australian units held continuous ties across the spur system, with artillery observers distributed along the front. Japanese localities persisted, as islands whose ability to coordinate had declined, as wire nets failed, and runners faced increasing risk. The campaign had not ended. Pockets remained, and Mangar's perimeter still required methodical reduction. But the largest, most intense sequence of assaults and counter-assaults had passed, and with it, the period when the outcome might have turned on a single uncollapsed gallery or an unspotted gun pit. After the seizure of the main ridges and the capture of Sepinggang airfield, the campaign entered a phase of resistance and adaptation. The pattern of continuous frontal clashes gave way to smaller, dispersed engagements as the Japanese garrison reverted to guerrilla-style tactics within the remaining pockets around Mangar and the hinterland east of the town. These remnants, often platoon or section-sized groups occupying tunnels, ravines, and partially collapsed bunkers, no longer operated as a cohesive brigade. Their goal shifted from defending fixed ground to inflicting attrition through ambushes, sniping, and night raids on supply routes. For the Australian command, this transition required a recalibration from assault operations to systematic clearance, patrolling, and the establishment of firm local control across a widening area. Adaptation began with the reorganization of the assault brigades. The 18th and 21st Brigades, after nearly 2 weeks of continuous combat, rotated companies out of the forward line for rest, medical attention, and refit. The 25th Brigade assumed the main burden of patrolling eastward toward Mangar, supported by light tanks, engineers, and reconnaissance detachments. The emphasis shifted toward locating and destroying remaining bunkers, recovering equipment, and neutralizing mines. Engineers converted the coastal road, pocked with craters and demolition pits, into a supply corridor for jeeps and amphibious vehicles. Water points and medical stations were established along it, transforming what had been a combat axis into a logistical lifeline, feeding both the occupation of Balikpapan and the continuing advance toward the airfield belt. The Japanese defenders adapted as well, trading organized resistance for concealment and movement through ravines and thick vegetation. Their capacity for large-scale counterattack had ended, but small groups still mounted effective harassment. Patrols reported snipers firing from treetops, sudden bursts of automatic fire from cave mouths thought to be sealed, and attempts to cut telephone lines along the coastal track. Ammunition shortages forced the use of improvised weapons, grenades manufactured from powder-filled cans, and Molotov-type bottles made from salvaged fuel drums. The remnants survived on dwindling rice stocks supplemented by foraging and what could be taken from abandoned supply dumps. Civilians in outlying villages often found themselves caught between the two sides, compelled to provide information, food, or shelter depending on who arrived first. Allied operations adjusted through a combination of reconnaissance, local intelligence, and methodical search patterns. Patrols advanced in small groups, supported by artillery observers who could call for fire on any detected concentration. Flame weapons and explosives remained the primary tools for bunker clearance. Engineers developed routines for dealing with tunnel networks, smoke grenades to test airflow, demolition charges placed at intersecting galleries, and controlled explosions to collapse chambers without excessive damage to nearby structures. The process demanded patience and precision. In the Mangar sector, some tunnel complexes extended hundreds of meters through coral and clay, containing both fighting positions and living quarters that had been dug since early 1944. Psychologically, the shift to scattered resistance altered the atmosphere of the campaign. The tension of sudden, close combat was replaced by fatigue from constant alertness and the monotony of daily sweeps through heat, rain, and mud. Units found themselves engaged not in set-piece battles, but in an ongoing effort to secure terrain, mark hazards, and prevent reoccupation. Disease and exhaustion competed with combat as sources of attrition. Malaria, dysentery, and skin infections became common despite preventive measures. Commanders instituted rest cycles, reorganized messes, and improved field sanitation to stabilize morale. Chaplains, medical officers, and welfare units reported that the psychological burden of the campaign stemmed as much from the persistence of minor threats as from the intensity of earlier fighting. At the same time, adaptation extended to logistics and engineering. With the coastal road partially reopened, supplies could now be brought forward by DUKWs and trucks, rather than by hand-carry or tracked vehicles. Artillery batteries repositioned near Sepinggang to support patrol operations toward Mangar, while lighter mortars were distributed to company level to provide immediate response to ambushes. Minesweeping continued offshore and inland. Hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were lifted along beaches and paths used by civilians returning to their homes. Repair of the Sepinggang airstrip began under RAAF supervision, involving both military engineers and local laborers. By mid-July, sections of the runway were firm enough to accept liaison aircraft, reducing the time required for casualty evacuation and aerial reconnaissance. Civil-military coordination became increasingly important as Balikpapan town filled with returning civilians and administrative teams. Australian civil affairs officers worked with Dutch representatives to restore order, issue ration cards, and begin rebuilding essential services. The process was complicated by damage from the bombardment and by the uncertainty of property ownership after years of occupation. Fuel depots and workshops were cordoned off for inspection and decontamination. Engineers examined surviving equipment to determine whether any of the refinery infrastructure could be salvaged. Much of it had been destroyed by Japanese demolition and subsequent shelling, but a few storage tanks and pipelines were intact enough for temporary use in water and fuel distribution. For the Japanese side, adaptation was constrained by exhaustion and isolation. Radio intercepts revealed declining communication between outposts and the absence of centralized command. Many remaining troops preferred to fight from prepared caves rather than attempt escape through terrain now dominated by patrols. Some chose suicide within their positions after ammunition ran out. Others surrendered, often after mediation by Indonesian intermediaries. The capture of these prisoners provided further evidence of the deterioration of supply and morale. Rations reduced to a few handfuls of rice a day, casualties untreated for weeks, and no expectation of relief from Java or other islands. Yet resistance continued sporadically, sustained by orders to fight to the last and by the physical difficulty of clearing every tunnel and ridge in a landscape suited to concealment. Within the Allied command structure, the pace of operations slowed but did not cease. Artillery remained on call for any detected movement beyond established perimeters. Patrols marked caves with colored flags to indicate cleared or uncleared status. Minesweepers extended their work eastward to open Mangar Bay for small landing craft. The arrival of additional RAAF personnel and engineers signaled a transition toward post-combat tasks. Reconstruction of airfields, repair of harbor facilities, and establishment of a base network to support future occupation duties. Even as the battlefield contracted, the effort to restore functionality over a devastated industrial zone demanded as much organization as the earlier assault. By the third week of July, the balance of the campaign had shifted decisively. Organized Japanese resistance had ended in Balikpapan itself. The remaining holdouts east of Mangar fought isolated skirmishes before being overrun or dispersing into the hills. The Australian units turned from offensive sweeps to stabilization. Engineers completed demolition of dangerous bunkers, built bridges over streams cut by bombardment, and extended communication lines between the beaches, the town, and Sepinggang. Air operations resumed from the repaired strip, conducting reconnaissance over Borneo's interior and monitoring any remnant enemy activity. The fighting had transformed into occupation and recovery, an adaptation not only of tactics but of purpose, as the focus moved from defeating resistance to rebuilding what the conflict had destroyed. The turning point of the Balikpapan campaign came in the middle of July 1945, when organized Japanese defense ceased to function as a coherent system. The cumulative effect of bombardment, attrition, and isolation broke the garrison's capacity to coordinate its remaining positions. By 13th to 14th July, Australian patrols moving east of Sepinggang found caves and pillboxes abandoned, their interiors strewn with equipment, weapons, and personal papers. Those that remained occupied did so in isolation, cut off from any supply or command link. The battle that had begun as a set-piece amphibious assault now became a series of cleanup operations, dangerous and slow, but no longer decisive in strategic terms. The shift in operational character reflected both external and internal factors. Externally, Japan's overall situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Allied advances in Luzon and Okinawa had severed maritime routes, and Borneo's garrisons could not be resupplied. Internally, the Balikpapan defenders had lost communication with higher command on Java. Allied intercepts suggested that the last messages sent from Balikpapan in early July reported heavy losses and requests for reinforcement, which went unanswered. Deprived of coordination, company groups fought according to local initiative. Some commanders gathered their men in central strongpoints to make a final stand. Others dispersed into the jungle to harass supply routes as small bands. The once structured defense of the oil zone had fragmented into survival efforts. For the Australian side, this disintegration of resistance posed its own challenge. Commanders had to decide how far to pursue remaining enemy elements without overextending logistics and exposing troops to unnecessary risk. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft showed scattered fires and movement near Mangar Bay, but intelligence from prisoners indicated that many positions were already empty. Thus, operations shifted toward encirclement and containment. Patrols advanced along parallel ridges, marking cleared sectors with flags and tape, while artillery maintained interdiction fire on gullies that could shelter retreating groups. The goal was not annihilation, but denial of organized reconstitution. On 15th July, the 25th Brigade launched the last major coordinated action of the campaign, a sweep through the Mangar area, supported by artillery and airstrikes. The assault met only patchy resistance. Isolated bunkers fired briefly before being silenced by tanks and flame weapons. By midday, patrols reached the eastern beaches, linking up with engineer detachments that had arrived by amphibious craft to clear mines and establish observation posts. Within 48 hours, the entire coastline from Balikpapan to Mangar lay under Allied control. The operation achieved its tactical objectives. The airfields and port facilities were secured, and the Japanese garrison ceased to exist as an organized military entity. The turning point was confirmed not only by the absence of effective resistance, but also by the shift in priorities within the Allied command. Artillery ceased its daily fire plans, naval bombardments ended, and headquarters reoriented toward base construction. The airstrip at Sepinggang received its first RAAF Dakota transports on July 17th, bringing supplies and evacuating wounded directly to Morotai. In Balikpapan town, engineers restored power lines and reopened sections of road linking the wharf to the refinery district. Minesweeping in the harbor recovered large quantities of wreckage, trawlers, barges, and scuttled tankers that testified to the scale of pre-landing demolitions. What had been the target of invasion now became a logistical hub for the occupation of southern Borneo. Japanese survivors confronted the reality of defeat unevenly. Some continued isolated fighting into late July, motivated by orders never to surrender. Others gave themselves up after mediation by Indonesian intermediaries or when surrounded. Australian intelligence records indicate that by the third week of July, roughly 750 prisoners had been taken, while another 1,500 were believed killed or missing since the start of the operation. Captured officers described their decision to remain as a matter of honor rather than expectation of victory. Many were emaciated and suffering from malaria or wounds untreated since the first week of the landing. Their statements confirmed that ammunition stocks had been exhausted and that communication with higher headquarters had ended days before the final collapse. For civilians, the turning point meant the first signs of normalcy returning to a devastated landscape. Refugees began to return from the interior, where they had fled during the bombardment. Australian civil affairs teams established food distribution points using military rations and salvage supplies. Dutch administrators returned to restore colonial authority, often finding local leaders who had filled the vacuum during the years of Japanese rule. The transition was uneasy. Collaboration, forced labor, and shortages had left deep social scars. Yet the reappearance of regular administration and the reopening of markets under military supervision marked a tangible change from the months of occupation and battle. Strategically, the capture of Balikpapan confirmed Allied control of the southern approaches to the South China Sea. Though the operation came late in the war, its logistical and symbolic value was clear. The harbor could now serve as a base for post-war occupation forces, and the airfields provided forward staging for flights across the archipelago. However, within weeks of the turning point, broader events overshadowed the campaign. News of heavy bombing raids on Japan and the imminent end of the war reached the troops in the field. For many, the realization that Balikpapan might be the last major amphibious operation of the Pacific War lent a retrospective weight to the weeks of effort and loss that had preceded this quiet conclusion. By the end of July, the lines of control stabilized. Patrols still encountered sporadic fire from individuals hiding in the hills, but organized resistance had ended. The focus now shifted fully to recovery and consolidation, reopening schools, hospitals, and supply depots, clearing remaining mines, and documenting the condition of oil installations for future repair. The turning point was thus not a single dramatic victory, but the moment when war gave way to occupation, when movement ceased to be measured in meters of ridge gained and began to be measured in the slow restoration of order. The end of organized fighting at Balikpapan produced immediate tasks that differed from those of the assault phase. Infantry companies shifted to search patterns through industrial ruins, residential streets, and ravines east of the town. Engineers marked and lifted mines in lanes used by carts and pedestrians, then moved to demolish unsafe galleries and casemates that could not be secured. Medical units expanded aid posts into small hospitals to treat both military and civilian casualties, with triage for blast injuries, burns, and malaria. Naval teams continued harbor clearance, locating scuttled craft and munitions on the approaches to the wharves. Administrative detachments began registering civilians, issuing ration cards, and reopening wells, while interpreter teams recorded statements from laborers who had worked on tunnels and fortifications. Withdrawal, in the sense of a return to pre-war patterns, remained distant. The refinery and storage complexes that had framed the area's value were largely inoperable. Of hundreds of tanks present before 1945, only a fraction could be patched for water or fuel distribution. Pump houses and pipe racks required full reconstruction rather than repair. Australian Civil Affairs and Dutch Netherlands Indies civil administration detachments surveyed workshops, pipe runs, and substations to rank what could be salvaged. Work parties drew on a mix of military engineers and local labor, paid in cash and rations. The port, once cleared of wrecks, received a flow of coastal shipping carrying rice, medical supplies, and tools. These shipments competed with military priorities for ammunition and engineer stores needed to keep the line of communication functioning to Mongar and inland posts. Casualty accounting proceeded alongside these tasks. Australian returns for Oboe Two recorded roughly 229 killed and about 630 to 650 wounded during the July operations. Estimates for Japanese losses, compiled from burial parties, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield counts, suggested between 2,000 and 3,000 dead in the Balikpapan sector, with 700 to 1,000 prisoners taken by late July. The imbalance reflected differences in fire support, logistics, and the tactical requirement to defend fixed positions without replenishment. Civilian losses were harder to quantify. Air and naval bombardments before and during the landing, demolitions by the defenders, and street fighting all contributed. Civil affairs officers created registers to document deaths and missing persons for compensation and property claims, but the disruption of records during occupation limited precision. The transition to a ceasefire followed wider events. After 15 August 1945, Japanese commanders on Borneo received orders to suspend offensive operations and to maintain positions pending surrender instructions. At Balikpapan, surviving elements around Mangar and in the hills east of the town sent intermediaries to discuss terms. Australian units halted major sweeps and substituted cordons and route control points, while reserving the right to respond to local firing. Formal surrender ceremonies for Japanese forces in Borneo occurred in early to mid-September under Australian command at specified locations. Local capitulations in the Balikpapan area followed the same framework, with the handover of weapons, depots, and maps of minefields and tunnel networks. These documents aided clearance and reduced the risk of accidents in areas already reoccupied by civilians. Withdrawal also meant the start of repatriation. Japanese troops were assembled in collection camps for disarmament, medical screening, and subsequent transfer to staging ports for return to the home islands. The process ran through late 1945 into 1946. Constrained by shipping and the need for quarantine, Australian forces began to stand down assault echelons and to reorganize for occupation and demobilization. Elements of the 7th Division remained to supervise surrender and reconstruction tasks before rotation to Australia for disbandment. Dutch officials resumed civil authority under Allied supervision, re-establishing courts, police, and revenue offices. Indonesian leaders, whose wartime experiences varied between collaboration, coercion, and quiet resistance, navigated the new political landscape in an archipelago where declarations of independence on Java and Sumatra in August 1945 transformed the context of every returned district. Humanitarian considerations expanded as refugees moved back to the coastal strip. Food distribution points issued rice and tinned meat. Medical teams vaccinated children against smallpox and treated dysentery clusters that followed the first rains. Forced laborers released from tunnel works or camps near the airfields sought transport to home districts, often hundreds of kilometers away along damaged roads and rivers. War graves units from the Allied side mapped burial sites for later consolidation, while local religious organizations attended to civilian dead. The presence of unexploded ordnance and booby traps required constant warnings. Posters and patrols tried to keep returning residents out of collapsed buildings and caves awaiting demolition. Security operations persisted at a reduced level. Isolated groups of Japanese soldiers, unaware of or unwilling to accept the ceasefire, occasionally fired on patrols in late August. Small bands of bandits and opportunists took advantage of the administrative vacuum on the outskirts, prompting the creation of mixed patrols with military police and local constables. These incidents did not change the overall trajectory, but served as reminders that combat's end did not equate to frictionless control. Artillery and naval gunfire plans were canceled, but mortars and small arms remained in daily use for local responses and for flare illumination during night cordon operations. The port's reopening allowed the evacuation of wounded and sick to Morotai and Australia, and brought in materials for reconstruction. Engineers repaired wharf faces, built temporary storage sheds, and laid pipelines from surviving tanks to improvised filling points. By late August, liaison aircraft were operating regularly from Sepinggang, and by early September, the Strip could accept transports under weight limits. This connectivity shortened delivery times for medical supplies, increased the tempo of mail and personnel movement, and enabled aerial mapping of inland roads for future administration. Comparative perspectives on the withdrawal revealed divergent experiences. For Australian units, the end of combat transitioned into documentation, salvage, and the management of surrender, followed by staged demobilization. For Japanese soldiers, it meant disarmament, medical checks, and a wait for ships amid uncertainty about families and homes. For Dutch administrators, it presented the task of reasserting authority over a district with damaged infrastructure and a population whose wartime loyalties could not be reduced to a single category. For Indonesian civilians, it opened a complex period in which security, food, and work were immediate needs, while political horizons widened rapidly beyond the pre-war colonial frame. By September 1945, Balikpapan had shifted from a battleground to an occupied hub within a changing regional order. The tactical objectives of Oboe Two, control of the port, town, and airfields, had been achieved, and combat operations had ceased. The immediate consequences were clear in physical terms: destroyed refineries, mined approaches, and a population returning to damaged neighborhoods. The wider consequences would unfold over months and years as authorities reconstructed the economy, settled claims, and navigated political change across the Netherlands East Indies. The battle's aftermath, therefore, consisted not only of withdrawals and surrenders, but also of the administrative and social tasks required to convert captured ground into a functioning community under a new post-war reality. The legacy of the Balikpapan operation extends across military practice, regional politics, and historical interpretation. In operational terms, it represented the final maturation of an Australian-led amphibious assault within the Southwest Pacific framework. The sequence, minesweeping, prolonged naval and air preparation, timed waves, rapid emplacement of artillery observers, and the close integration of infantry, armor, and engineers, codified procedures that had been refined since 1943. Specific techniques from Balikpapan entered post-war doctrine: early landing of forward observers to bridge the gap between naval guns and field artillery, systematic bunker reduction that paired tank direct fire with engineered demolition, flamethrower employment under infantry control, and traffic discipline from beach to crest using pre-marked circuits. The difficulties recorded: mislandings under smoke, telephone lines cut by shelling, dead ground for platoon radios, and the fragility of single-lane exits were folded into training syllabi that emphasized redundancy in communications and the rapid creation of alternate routes. For the Royal Australian Air Force and supporting U.S. air elements, the campaign underscored the constraints of distance and basing. Sorties staged from the southern Philippines lengthened the response time for on-call support, which reinforced the value of pre-planned time-on-target packages and air liaison at company level. The early reopening of Sepinggang shortened the cycle for reconnaissance and evacuation, and demonstrated the advantage of air engineers moving in step with assault echelons. Naval forces recorded the effect of dense defensive minefields in confined waters and the need for prolonged counter-battery duels against guns sighted on narrow ridges above beaches. The sequence of bombardment, beachhead expansion, and immediate engineer exploitation became a case study for amphibious staff colleges after the war. Strategically, analysts have weighed the operation's timing and objectives against the wider context of mid-1945. The stated goals: denial of residual oil capacity, control of a port and airfields on the Makassar Strait, and support to the re-establishment of civil authority, were achieved. Yet by July, the Japanese shipping system that once drew on Balikpapan's refineries had already been disrupted beyond practical repair. This led to a post-war debate within Australian and Allied historiography over the necessity of Oboe Two. One line of analysis emphasizes the political and coalition dimensions, honoring commitments to the Netherlands government in exile, maintaining momentum in the Southwest Pacific area, and ensuring an Australian formation concluded the war with a significant independent operation. Another line focuses on military opportunity cost, asking whether resources dedicated to Borneo could have been conserved without affecting Japan's decision calculus in August. The archival record supports elements of both views, and the balance drawn by historians varies with their weighting of political obligation, military risk, and the value of securing a base for post-war administration. The human results frame the operation's enduring significance. Australian official returns for July's 1945 at Balikpapan record approximately 229 killed and roughly 630 to 650 wounded. Japanese garrison losses are estimated between 2,000 and 3,000 killed, with about 700 to 1,000 taken prisoner by late July. These figures reflect asymmetries in fire support and supply, but they also reflect the character of the ground, which enforced short-range fighting in bunkers, caves, and urban rubble. Civilian losses are harder to quantify. Forced labor, bombardment, and demolitions took a toll that civil affairs officers attempted to measure through registers for compensation and property claims. The presence of unexploded ordnance and mined approaches continued to generate casualties after the end of fighting, shaping local memories of the campaign beyond the dates of formal surrender. Politically, Balikpapan formed one episode in the rapid transition from occupation to decolonization in the Netherlands East Indies. Dutch administrators returned under Allied auspices to re-establish control, reopen courts, and manage property issues. Indonesian leaders who had navigated the constraints of Japanese rule encountered a new situation after August 1945, as declarations of independence on Java and Sumatra redefined regional expectations. The reassertion of colonial authority at Balikpapan occurred alongside the emergence of Indonesian nationalism, and the city's post-war trajectory reflected that tension. Australian forces supervised surrender, repatriation, and initial reconstruction through late 1945 before demobilization and withdrawal, while sovereignty questions broadened into negotiations and conflict that concluded with the transfer of power to the Republic of Indonesia in 1949. Economically, the refinery and storage complex that motivated early wartime competition could not be restored quickly. Repeated air attacks in 1944, defender demolitions in 1945, and naval gunfire before the landing left pipe racks, cracking units, and tank farms damaged beyond immediate repair. Engineers salvaged limited capacity for water and fuel distribution, and port clearance reopened wharfage for coastal shipping, but full industrial function required post-war investment. This outcome shaped later assessments. The operation secured terrain that had strategic location and administrative value, but limited short-term economic yield. In the longer run, Balikpapan's oil industry re-emerged under changed political conditions, linking the wartime fight for infrastructure to the post-war reconstruction of a national economy. Memory and commemoration evolved along parallel lines in Australia and Indonesia. For Australian units, Balikpapan appears in divisional histories and regimental roles as the last large assault of the Pacific War, with cemeteries and memorials listing those killed in July 1945. Training institutions preserved lessons from bunker and cave fighting and from the logistics of beach-to-crest operations. In Indonesian local memory, the battle is part of a layered narrative that includes Dutch colonial rule, Japanese occupation, and the subsequent struggle for independence. The physical traces of the campaign, tunnel systems, collapsed tanks, and repaired airfields, formed reference points for civic education and for the management of unexploded ordnance well into the post-war period. From a comparative perspective within the Oboe series, Balikpapan stands out for the scale of its preparatory fires, the density of its coastal defenses, and the complexity of clearing an industrial city edging a ridge system. Tarakan and Brunei Bay provided earlier rehearsals and logistical stepping stones. Balikpapan concentrated those experiences under one command and within a compressed timeline. The integration achieved, naval, air, artillery, armor, engineers, infantry, civil affairs, and minesweeping, offers a case study in how late war coalitions executed amphibious objectives under conditions of partial strategic redundancy. The result did not hinge on a single tactical episode, but on the cumulative effect of bounded advances, systematic clearance, and sustained supply. By the time surrender orders reached Borneo, Balikpapan had already shifted from combat to administration. The operation's significance thus lies in the convergence of three outcomes. It closed an Australian combat narrative with a successful large-scale landing. It secured a node that facilitated occupation and post-war control of sea and air routes, and it intersected with a regional political transition that would render colonial-era objectives temporary. The battle's record, dates, unit assignments, casualty returns, and engineering logs supports a precise reconstruction, Its meaning continues to be reassessed in light of wider questions about coalition warfare, the relationship between tactical success and strategic necessity, and the ways in which wartime actions shape the institutions, economies, and memories that follow.